Hello everyone, it's Ten Types, and today I'm going to be going over toward Reklev's what's this deck called? I think it's called Charizard Box. There we go, Charizard Box from this event. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. It can't be that hard, but I'm also not very talented. Or at least not very talented at pronouncing things. But I am talented at Pokemon cards, and I wanted to talk about this deck. So this finished third out of I think 800 people. That's pretty impressive. Tord Reklev is a very talented player but also a good deck builder, and this is a really interesting deck. Now, it's a little bit silly, and I'm going to say that as well, and I believe Tord Reklev himself said that, but it's certainly not just a bunch of random cards. And I want to talk about the different synergies and why every card's in the deck and what it can do, because I think there are some cards that people don't fully understand why they're there, and so I want to help clear things up a little bit. First of all, this is a Charizard EX deck. Charizard EX is really powerful. It's high HP, its ability powers things up as well. That being said, it doesn't power up most of the attackers in this deck other than itself. It can be used to power up Radiant Charizard, Pidgeot EX. I mean, it really can be useful for powering up anything, and we'll talk about that when we get to the other attackers, but for the most part, it's there because it's a really good attacker. But its attack here, first of all, it's a Terra Pokemon Dark type. Its ability, I mentioned, accelerates fire energy from the deck. But Burning Darkness, it does 180 for 2 fire, and it does 30 more for each prize your opponent has taken. And which is pretty interesting because that means you're hitting 180 or 210 or 240 or 270. And a lot of those numbers are a little bit shorter or a bit lower than what you want to be hitting. You're looking to hit numbers like 220 and 280, and you're just a little short on those. So we'll talk about that as we proceed through this video. And this list runs a lot of different cards as well. There's a lot of one-ofs. I don't remember how many there were. I know it says somewhere, but let's see. So this grid is 8 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 43 unique cards. That's a bunch of one-ofs. We yeah, there are a lot of one-ofs is what I'm saying, which leads to some inconsistencies, but means that you kind of need to adapt on your feet. I don't necessarily think this deck is perfect. In fact, I think it's definitely not perfect, and I'm going to talk about a few of those things. Of course, other than the consistency issues and certain things like that, it's not like a bad deck, though. It's a very good deck and an interesting deck. I guess I didn't talk about the Charmanders. There are two Charmanders. There's this one which does 30 and has 60 HP, and this one that has 70 HP and can discard a stadium. This is a very common split. Well, okay, normally you'd have like 4 Charmanders, but this is probably the most logical split of two Charmanders, and so yeah, we see that in the deck. It doesn't really matter too much, but as I said, you'll come up a little short, and so you can come in with this Charmander or potentially this Charmander, but most likely the one that hits 30 for 1 and finish off a target. And as I said, we'll talk about that throughout this video because there are a lot of ways of adding on just a little bit of extra damage and getting the amount you need to essentially get one shot. So you can actually push it up a bunch as well. So if you need to be hitting 220 and you're hitting 180, well, yeah, you can then boost it up 40. And as I said, we'll talk about that. Also, this is pre-rotation. So then we have Pidgeot EX, and Pidgey Call for Family is useful. Pidgeot EX, its ability to search your deck for any card every single turn is incredibly useful unless your opponent's played Path to the Peak, in which case it doesn't do anything because Path to the Peak shuts it down. In addition to that, Blustery Wind, 120 for colorless. Colorless, you may discard a stadium in play. You can use that for fire energy, or you can use it with double turbo energy. Double turbo energy is 2 colorless on any Pokemon, but you do 20 less. This is useful on a number of Pokemon, but most notably Pidgeot EX. Well, actually, no, not most notably Pidgeot EX. That's probably second most notably, or maybe third. You can use it with Radiant Charizard and Machamp V, but we'll talk about those later. You can use it on Inteleon and I mean pretty much anything, but except for Charizard. But for the most part, you're looking to use it on Metacham or Pidgeot or Radiant Charizard. And Pidgeot EX's attack is pretty decent. It has 280 HP. It is a stage 2. It's essentially directly worse of an attacker compared to Charizard, but there are times when you may have to use it. You only run 2 Charizards. You do run 2 copies of Super Rod, which we'll get to, but Pidgeot can be an attacking option and can be an important attacking option. Also, it has Free Retreat. That's nice. Aside from that, we have Bibarel. Bidoof is obviously here to evolve into Bibarel. This is the best Bidoof. And Bibarel here, Industrious Incisors. Once during a turn, you may draw cards until you have 5 in your hand, and then you flip a coin for 3 colors, 100, or 0 if you flip tails. Oh, and one thing before we hop fully into the video and we get on with things a little more. First of all, I'd love it if you subscribe, but also once I reach 1,000 subscribers, I have some really cool stuff going on. And on top of that, I'm also going to be doing a Family Feud video, which is, I guess, not my 1,000 subscriber celebration, but with that, if you want to be in that, you can comment or message me or whatever. And then also down below, there will be a Google form that I would love if you would fill out. It is going to be on the Family Feud stuff, and so I'm looking forward to doing that. I've gotten some responses, but I need a few more to finish things up. But anyways, back into the video. The barrel drop till year 5 is obviously good. It it's not so good when you have a big hand. So we'll talk about the supporter lineup. This is, in my opinion, the weakest aspect of the deck. I think the supporter lineup is not. Okay, there's some supporters that I am not big fans of, or one specific supporter I'm not a big fan of. But that's my personal preference as well. But aside from that, they do grow your hand some. So Pidgeot EX and Barrel are very different cards. Pidgeot EX tends to work well when you have lots of one-ofs like this deck where you can kind of search them out every single turn. The barrel works kind of when you can just play with what you got, and that doesn't necessarily work very well with a rare candy based deck with lots of unique cards. We do see 4 rare candy and lots of ways to find Charizard, however, and a decent amount of ways to find, or I guess more ways to find Charmander. So it's it's pretty interesting here. You have obviously a lot of things going on. So with the barrel, you're going to draw into all sorts of weird hands with the barrel. Having 5 cards from your deck is you can have a lot of variability with a deck like this with some different options, and so probably a few of those cards are going to end up being useless in whatever situation you're in. And on top of that, some will be just, I don't know, some will be not optimal. So Barrel isn't, you can't just rely on Barrel. I mean, you kind of can. It depends on the situation, but mostly Barrel is useful here for late game Path to Peak Iono plays by your opponent, and there are a number of decks that do that. So this is your best way to counter that. Versus Pidgeot EX will probably be your main engine, but it also is a 2-prize liability. So you could go either way for which one's better. Post rotation, I believe that Pidgeot EX is better with no Path to the Peak. Not necessarily in Charizard, but in general. But the barrel is obviously is useful here with a lot of Path to the Peak, and there are other things that can cause issues with these. You want to be watching out for Pidgeot EX's weakness, literally, to a lightning type Pokemon, and if you are up against a deck like Mawile or potentially Iron Hands, then you want to be careful of that because you don't want to be giving up 3 prizes, 2 or 3 prizes with Pidgeot. And I guess with the barrel being a single prize liability, that could be a thing, but it's not that bad. You have other single prize liabilities that are probably going to be in play. I would be surprised if, I mean, well, with the barrel, you're probably having Squovit in play. I'll talk about Squovit now. Its ability Nest Stash. When starting your turn, you may shuffle a card and shuffle your hand, put it on the bottom of your deck, draw 1 card. Assuming you put any cards there, you can use a bite, but yeah, that's not great. It's pretty bad. Also, I don't know why Limitless keeps going back twice. Anyways, Squova here is useful with the barrel, and that is more of a liability with only 60 HP. I guess I'll talk about the other support Pokemon now. I guess most of them are support. There's a lot of different Pokemon here, obviously. They all have different categories. Manaphy is bench barrier, protecting you from bench damage. Jirachi is protecting you from bench damage counters from pretty much Sableye. Just stop Sableye. In my opinion, this card isn't that good. I would probably cut this, although I know there are some people who really love this. There's also, of course, this was played in a tournament. If you're playing a tournament versus a ladder in different types of tournaments, sometimes a card like Jirachi could be better or could be worse. I personally am not a massive fan of it. I know some people like it a lot. This deck isn't horrible against Sableye, which is essentially the only thing that Jirachi is stopping. Not the only thing. There's Medicham V as well, but Sableye is not the end of the world for this deck. It's not great, and certainly having a counter to it is useful, but it's personally a card that I wouldn't include. And obviously, it frees up a deck space, a bench space, and it's also not a basic Pokemon that you're going to be starting, it's not the worst starter, but it's certainly not ideal either. And so, yeah, you have that weirdness of Jirachi there. You could make the same argument to Manaphy, but I would personally say Manaphy's better than Jirachi, and I think most people agree upon that. But Jirachi, yeah, I'd potentially cut this if you're looking at things to cut, because this deck is pretty interesting. It has some very solid aspects. The other basic support, like draw engine card, I guess, as a single prize is going to be Mew here from Celebrations, Mysterious Tail. If it's in the active, you can look at the top 6 cards of your deck, put an item you find there into your hand, shuffle the other cards back into your deck. This is a really intriguing inclusion in this deck. I know that Mew sees a lot of play within Charizard because obviously it can get rare candies, and rare candies are important in any stage 2 deck, and it can get other items as well. I mean, you have 18, it looks like, which is a little low for a deck that plays Mew. There's only one Mew, and I know Mew's common in Charizard. It is rotating as well. Some of these cards are obviously rotating, and it's an interesting inclusion. My major criticism with Mew here is it can get stuck in the active position, so it's a little awkward to use. There is essentially no switch. There's a card that kind of acts like switch, or there are a few. Um, and then of course you can manually retreat, but you don't play a ton of energy, so that's a little sketchy. That being said, I mean, Mew's a pretty decent card and will give you more consistency, so I definitely see why it's there and it is pretty useful. Aside from that, let's talk about some of the other engine pieces. Where you got Squawkabilly EX, which just lets you discard your hand, draw 6 on the first turn of the game, which is useful. It has an attack that you can use as well, which isn't terrible. But in a deck like this, it's probably not going to be the option you're going for. In addition to that, we have Lumineon V on play searching for a supporter, and Rotom V, its ability to end your turn instant charge here, which just lets you draw 3 cards, which is pretty useful. I know it's played very commonly in Charizard decks and pretty much not much. Oh, yeah, and control. And it's pretty good in both of those decks. Aside from that, it's good. I don't know how I feel about Lumineon V. Lumineon V is kind of like another Pidgeot EX in the sense it is a multi-prize liability that also searches out support, like a specific card, in this case, a specific supporter. You do run 4 copies of Ultra Ball to be able to search it out, and we'll talk about that a little more later because Ultra Ball has a lot of synergies with certain cards here, but then doesn't necessarily have a ton of synergy with everything either. So you kind of have 2 different things in the deck and aspects that are kind of fighting each other, which is really interesting and potentially holding the deck back. I'll talk about that. But then we have some more attackers. Or I guess I'll talk about Inteleon next. Its ability quick shooting. When starting a turn, you can put 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, as well as Medicham V. It's attack for 2 colorless. Yoga Loop. You can use Smash Uppercut, by the way, for 100 for fighting colorless colors, hitting through resistance. You will potentially use this sometimes. Of course, it's not super powerful, and it's kind of hard to use, so it's probably not what you're going to be leaning into, but it definitely is an option here. But Yoga Loop here is the major attack that puts 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, and then you for 2 colors, and then you take another turn after that, assuming you got the KO. So Inteleon plus Medicham V do give you essentially 40 extra damage. Medicham V is kind of like extra damage. It's not extra damage though. So if you need extra damage at the end of the game, the last turn of the game, this doesn't. It gets the extra damage essentially the next turn. Your opponent has the option to heal in between. It's weaker than an ability that would just ping 2, but well, okay, there are certain scenarios when it's not, but for the most part it is. But the main thing with Medicham V here is, of course, the fact that it can be used to clean up those KOs. So if you are hitting 180 with Charizard, then you can go and ping with Inteleon, essentially ping with the attack of Medicham V, and then take an extra turn. So essentially you are able to buff your damage by 40, and that's really nice. That's why Medicham V and Inteleon are in the deck. There is some more spread stuff, but they are spread cards, and very good spread cards at that. Inteleon is a little awkward. We do have Heap Calling, which is an attacking option, searching for basic Rapid Strike Pokemon, putting them onto your bench, which would be Medicham V and or Rapid Strike Urshifu V, which evolves into the V Max, which I'll talk about now. Rapid Strike Urshifu V, 150 for fighting colorless, is actually really, really interesting. Strafe, also 34 in fighting, swing to the bench. This is probably one of the most overlooked Pokemon in the TCG that was like good and saw a lot of play, which is kind of weird because of course it evolves into Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX, which is in this deck. But Rapid Strike Urshifu V is not bad. 150 for fighting colorless is definitely an option, especially if you're up against a deck that's weak, most notably Arceus V-Star. Presumably they're not running Dunsparce to remove weakness, so you can just hit with 100 Furious Blows for relatively easy KO. The deck only runs 1 copy of Rapid Strike Energy though, and that needs to be on. But that's a little awkward, but certainly you can search it out with a few different cards, Pidgeot EX as well as Rhon here. And so you can just go in with that, and that's pretty good. And 150 is not a terrible damage output, especially for a basic Pokemon. It's not necessarily one-shotting stuff, certainly not one-shotting multi-prizers. It will be that aren't weak. It will be one-shotting single prizers though, but it's not doing a great job of that. It's not super efficient. Strafe is an option as well, which is pretty interesting. It does one-shot Pokemon like Bidoof or a few other Pokemon that are weak, probably some Mareeps, and there are some Pokemon that it's good against. So pretty much if you're up against Miraidon, this Pokemon is really good. its own right even before you evolve, although it is good when you evolve. That being said, Rapsic Urshifu VMAX is also really good. You have two attacks here, Gale Thrust, which again does 150. This time it's for one fighting energy if you swing in. Honestly, it's about as good as the attack on the V, but obviously it's an evolution. Well, okay, that's not necessarily true. In this deck, it's about as good as the V. The reason is because you can get the extra energy on relatively easily through Charizard EX just evolving potentially earlier on because this is a VMAX. It kind of functions as a stage 1 and Charizard functions as a stage 2, so I guess you can make that argument. But for the most part, Gale Thrust is not amazing in this deck. It's not like you're going to be healing up because, well, then you lose the energy and then you can't get it back because I'm pretty sure there is no way of doing that in this deck. Aside from that, obviously, that Gale Thrust is not a bad attack. You do have more HP, but you're giving up another prize, so evolving, you do it for that reason if you want to use Gale Thrust. But the other attack, of course, G-Max Rapid Flow, is really iconic in the Pokemon TCG and really powerful for fighting colorless. Discard all energy from this Pokemon. Does 120 to 2 your opponent's bench Pokemon. This is, of course, bench snipe, which is really powerful. And in this deck, you're able to hit your opponent's bench just once, though. You can only use this attack once. As I said, if you discard the energy, which you obviously have to do when you attack with it, then you cannot be attacking with this attack ever again. You do have that extra spread-based damage, I guess, with the Inteleon from Chilling Reign to use Quick Shooting, as well as the Medicham V to place damage counters. That being said, those aren't adding absurd amounts of damage, so you need to be doing most of your damage with G-Max Rapid Flow. Potentially, you could combine G-Max Rapid Flow with Charizard EX's attack as well. You can attack once with G-Max Rapid Flow and twice with Charizard EX to potentially take 6 prizes. Keep in mind that might not happen, but you do have lots of ways of damage manipulating, and this is another one. However, this is definitely the hardest attack in the deck to use. I think I'm looking at the other attacks, but yeah, other than Radiant Charizard, yes, if you want to use that really early, which we'll talk about now, but you can use that as well. Radiant Charizard here, Excited Heart, its ability is pretty much a part of its attack cost, and it says your attacks, this Pokemon's attacks cost 1 colorless less for each prize card your opponent's taken. So after they've taken 4 prize cards, the Combustion Blast will just be 1 fire energy. It does 250 for 5 normally fire colorless. Next turn, it can't use Combustion Blast. 250 is actually more than enough for most situations, except for the situations where it's in fact less than enough. It's 250 is not really a number you're looking to hit. You're either looking to hit a little less and settle for a cheaper attack cost, or a little more, which obviously you don't hit. But with Medicham V and Inteleon, you can hit that like 280 threshold, though you're not really going to be getting to that. You could get to 310, but the 310 threshold for Charizard EX doesn't really matter. 310 is a threshold on UV Max and Gardevoir EX, but those are both weak to Charizard EX, so that doesn't matter too much here. But as I said, you'll be looking to hit potentially that 280. Generally, you're looking at Radiant Charizard, of course, at the end of the game, however. So, as I said, Medicham V, you can't use it on your last turn. Like, you can't attack with Radiant Charizard and Medicham V the same turn, but you can attack with Radiant Charizard and then imping with Inteleon, and next turn just attack with Medicham V. One thing I didn't say about Medicham V, I guess, which I should have said as well, relating to Inteleon, Medicham V gives you an extra turn, meaning that you can ping with Inteleon again. So if you have Inteleon in play, or if you are able to get Inteleon into play that like extra turn you're given, then you can just go ahead and ping extra damage. So Medicham V might just not be adding 20 damage, it might be adding 40. Also, you can't Yoga Loop multiple turns in a row. That's something to consider. Even if you don't take the KO, you cannot Yoga Loop multiple turns in a row. That's something that some people sometimes forget. So if you attack and just want to ping 20 somewhere and not take a KO, you're not going to be able to Yoga Loop at all next turn because that's what the effect of the attack says. Aside from that, though, you are leaning to that spread element, but as I said, you are hitting also sometimes a little too much. Some Pokemon, in fact, a lot of Pokemon, some Pokemon in this deck, in fact, have like 220, 230 HP. With that, Rapstick Urshifu V, Medicham V is a little lower, Rotom V, Lumineon V, and Squawkabilly EX all even a little bit lower than that, but that 220, 230 damage threshold is an interesting threshold, and Radiant Charizard is a powerful Pokemon. In fact, the most powerful early game Pokemon in the deck. So you are looking to use Combustion Blast potentially as early as turn 2. The way you can do that is you evolve into Charizard EX, get 3 fire energy on from the ability, and then attach a double turbo. Double turbo energy, as I said earlier, does reduce the damage output you have by 20. But that being said, you are now able to use Combustion Blast, 230 damage, turn 2, potentially. Although probably not turn 2, but you can certainly use it turn 3. You don't need to set 5 energy on it. You can set like 3, which will be and 1 acceleration from Charizard EX, 1 energy acceleration from Charizard EX, or all 3, or you could do 1 from Fire from Charizard EX and the double turbo. You have a lot of versatility with Radiant Charizard. Normally in Dex it's only a late game threat, but now with this option, with the Charizard EX and the double turbo energy, you can attack with it much easier. And I didn't even talk about Rhon yet, which accelerates in energy. Rhon is a really crucial card to this deck. It's also like a super broken, maybe not broken, but super good card. One of the best cards rotating, in my opinion, because if one of your Pokemon was knocked out last turn, you can accelerate a basic energy from your discard to one of your Pokemon in play. And then you search your deck for any card. You do need to have the energy to accelerate, so generally this isn't your first supporter or like second, maybe like your third supporter of the game is pretty common if you play it, and that's like a great turn to use it. You can use it multiple times, obviously, as well, but the list only runs 1 copy. You can recover it. Anyway, I'm getting too much into the weeds on this card right now, but really the thing that it's good for is accelerating energy to obviously your Pokemon and then bursting an attacker into play, which is a big theme of this deck. This deck has multiple ways of just bursting stuff into play, bursting extra damage with that Inteleon as well in the miniature MV. But those attackers, you can do that with Rhon and Thorton. Thorton is, I think, the most misunderstood and underrated card in this deck. Rhon is obviously good. It gets extra energy in play. It literally searches for anything. It's another great search option in addition to something like Force Steel Star and Arven or Pidgeot EX itself or Lumineon V. Rhon is really good. Thornton is a bit different. It does burst stuff into play, but what it does is it says choose a basic Pokemon you have in play, or I guess choose a basic Pokemon in your discard and switch it with a basic Pokemon in play. All effects, including cards, damage counters, special conditions, and turns in play, remain. And turns in play is the big thing here, because if a Pokemon has just been played down, you can't evolve it. But if it's already been in play 1 turn, then you can evolve it. So if you're in a situation you have a Charizard and you have no Charmanders on the bench, and then your only Charizard's knocked out, well, that's tough because you really want Charizard in play. It's a really good Pokemon, but you can't do it because you don't have a Charmander. But let's say you had a Rotom V in play. That's pretty common. Well, now you can play Thornton, and then Thornton is going to transform the Rotom V into that Charmander. But not only is it now a Charmander, but it's a Charmander that's already been in play at least 1 turn. I mean, you can just right away evolve it, even though that doesn't necessarily. It hasn't actually been in play more than a turn. The game thinks that it has because it maintains the amount of turns in play, which is a massive effect. Meaning, if, as I said, that scenario with the Charizards you can technically, you can do that with Urshifu or Sabal or whatever. It's quite useful. It also does act as recovery, so you can recover Radiant Charizard and stuff like that. And as I said with the Rotom V example, although this is probably best with Lumineon V or Squawkabilly EX or potentially some other Pokemon, it does take a Pokemon out of play, so it's kind of like a scoop up net. It's not exactly like a scoop up net though, because I mean it's not actually getting scooped up. If you want to scoop up net though, you have Professor Terra's scenario. Put one of your Pokemon in play into your hand. You discard all attached cards, which is a little annoying, but this is healing or removing a card from play, removing the option for your opponent to gust it back up into play with boss's orders. So that is really nice. It's healing, as I said, but it's also reusing Charizard EX's ability, potentially doing some other stuff. I don't know. Mostly it's just there for healing and then like removing a boss target from play. Of course, the list does run boss and counter catcher as well. Pretty common. There's not really too much to go into there. They're both just good cards and they're very similar cards. You do have Arven, which can search out any item, which of course would be rare candy, like counter catcher, or some other item, but yeah. And then Force Steel Stone. This is my first criticism. I think Arven with only 1 tool is pretty weak. And as I said earlier, this deck has a big focus on pushing that damage threshold a little higher, and there are lots of tools that do that. Notably Defiance Belt, no, sorry, Defiance Band, I think, and Vitality Band both are able to just push you up a little bit more damage, and they're both pretty useful. I think Defiance Band is a little more underrated, but very good. And then Vitality Band is also very good. A little underrated as well, but they're both decent cards. Nothing insane either. I'm not saying they're like super good cards, but I would definitely only play Arven if you had a second tool. You can technically like Ultra Ball for Arven for no Ultra Ball for Lumineon V for Arven for 4 Sealstone plus whatever item you need, which is an option, but it's obviously a lot of cards and it's like not the most common thing. It certainly is a thing that you can use, and I don't despise Arven. I kind of do actually. I know some people like it, but it's not my favorite thing. Iono is a really good supporter. It disrupts your opponent and obviously draws you cards. Not too much to say about it other than it's really good. The only supporter that's played multiple copies of here. Worker. Now we need to talk about Worker, Avery, and Peonia. These are all the same supporter. They're not actually all the same supporter, but they're all very similar supporters. They're all essentially draw 3 supporters. Worker and Avery directly draw 3 and then disrupt your opponent. Or Worker discards a stadium in play, notably Path to the Peak. And this is a bit of an issue for me. There aren't a lot of path bumps, which seems kind of scary. You do have Worker. I did mention that you can attack with Pidgeot EX, and you have 2 stadiums. Collapse Stadium, which allows you to remove a Pokemon from play, like Professor Toad's scenario does, but it's also disruption, and it's useful. Art Zone, which is a Pokemon search style stadium, and those are both path bombs as well. But then you have Worker, but that's about it. They're okay. And then we have Avery. I am not a big fan of this. This removes your opponent's Pokemon from play. Honestly, like the reason you play a card like Collapse Stadium is to remove your own Pokemon from play. Avery is not good. I mean it's not terrible. Avery is not a terrible card. I've been on record to say that it's not a great card. It's a pretty mediocre card. It's not a terrible card though. I would probably cut it from this deck though. Not gonna lie, I would definitely play a card like like a third Iono over it. I feel like Avery is not super good. I know there are certain matchups when it can be good and certain scenarios, but I've played a lot of Pokemon. I've almost never. So I've been Avery'd a lot. I think there have been, I'd say half the time it literally does nothing. So in which case they just played draw 3, which is a little underrated. I think just a straight draw 3 card is a little underrated, but still not that good. Maybe half the time it helps me. So that's obviously not good. Like you don't want to help your opponent, but like or no, like yeah, a quarter of the time, half of the half, it helps me, which is like not good. You don't want to be playing supporters that are helping your opponent. Obviously, you are drawing 3, but it's draw 3 with a downside in that case. An eighth of the time, it is really not great for me, and it really hurts me. And then an eighth of the time, it is a minor inconvenience, but like nothing too bad. So that's only 1/8 of the time. This is actually worse, like noticeably worse than, or noticeably better, worse for your opponent than a card like Hop or Pneumonia or How or whatever, all those draw 3 supporters. Worker is essentially always, it's not always going to have value. It will just be a draw 3 maybe like half the time. Then the other half of the time it's going to be pretty good and give you a lot of versatility. Keep in mind you can only play 1 stadium per turn, but there are certain little shenanigans with stadiums you can do with a Worker. Lastly, we have Peonia. Again, a card that some people are gonna say isn't a draw 3 card. Um, it's not exactly a draw 3. It says put up to 3 prize cards into your hand, and then for each prize card you put into your hand this way. You put a card from your hand face down as a prize card. This is obviously so that your prizes aren't like you can't just take prizes, but you do get to choose the prizes, and potentially you'll have a big hand. So these 3 cards, obviously, well, okay, the 2 just straight draw 3 cards are going to grow your hand. Peonia likes a big hand because once you have a big hand, you're then able to kind of manage your prizes really well. Peonia is probably one of the most undervalued cards in the TCG right now. I think along with something like Thornton, which I mentioned earlier, because it lets you know your prizes, obviously not just what is prized, but where it's prized, and then put things into your prizes and kind of just do some really nice stuff. And this is really crucial, especially if you're playing in tournament. I'd oh, you can count prizes. You don't have to. Some people think it's like the biggest deal in the world. It's not. It's something. It's useful. It's very useful, and it can definitely give you a leg up. But in this case, Peonia counting prizes if you're playing Peonia, or like understanding your prizes, knowing what's prized, what Peonia is so important because that's like the best part of it. That you get to just take 3 cards, but they're not 3 random cards from your deck. They're 3 cards that are randomly selected from a pool of a certain amount of cards. If you just have 6 prizes, then it's from 6 cards, but you know what those 6 cards are. You have the ability to know that most of the time, assuming you've searched your deck, which you probably will have. And then if you've taken 3 prizes, you know exactly what they are. So now this card says draw 3 specific cards. Not 3 cards of your choosing, but 3 cards, 3 specific cards. If you knew exactly what cards you were going to draw before you played a card like Iono or Professor's Research, or certainly Avery or Worker, then you'd be like, oh, I definitely need to play this, or maybe not. So then you could be like, oh, well, if I Peonia, I'm going to draw 3 and I'm going to get these 3 specific cards. On top of that, it's really good because you can put cards into your prizes that you want for later. That means that after you take a KO, you can take with those Peonia prizes. Um, and so that means you know exactly what you're getting, and it'll be exactly what you did at the time, hopefully. Of course, if you're putting a card into your prizes, that means you don't have it now, so you want to kind of manage that properly. One thing that, especially in tournament, that is important to note is if you see your opponent play Peonia, and then they obviously take cards out of the prizes, put more cards into the prizes, especially if they have a big hand, meaning that they're going to do this more precisely and have a better control of it. And then you see them take a prize. One, if it's a prize that, well, there's a lot of different things, but if they take a specific prize that they put back with Peonia earlier, that means that they got the card that they want, and you should Iono them. But probably, I mean, if they have like a 1 card hand, then maybe not, but it's still in consideration because you now know that they have exactly what they want. I suppose you could mind game your opponent by taking purposely bad cards from your prizes that you put in there with Peonia to make them think that you're taking good cards and then try to get Ionoed out of a bad hand into a good hand. I don't think Pokemon players think that far ahead. I know I don't. I honestly don't play Peonia super well, but it's a really powerful card. Anyways, those 3 are fine. I'm not a big fan of Avery. I'm a fan of Peonia, but obviously some people are big fans of Avery. Oh, and Peonia obviously gets cards out of your prizes. So if you get unlucky with prizing and need something, it might be able to get it out, or it might not, depending on the situation, because you could just miss it. Oh wait, I forgot about it in Pokemon. I realized that. Okay, we need to talk about Mawile. Mawile is actually a somewhat controversial Pokemon within tournaments, or I should say, Control is a bit of a somewhat controversial video. And I think actually tomorrow I'm going to be making a video talking about Control versus Stall versus Mill and the differences between that. So stay tuned for that. I don't know if I talked about Mawile, but I talked about Snorlax. And Mawile is just Snorlax, kind of, but its attack says your opponent can't retreat. This is obviously really good if you can trap something in the active. Also, they take 90 more damage next turn if they're hit into. If they switch out, obviously they can't retreat, but if they play a switch card, then you won't be hitting for they won't be taking 90 more damage. But if they don't, you can use this, and that can be useful. I think it's the most underrated part of Mawile because just stopping retreating is incredibly powerful. But the 90 extra damage can be really useful as well. I mentioned damage buffing. That's a lot of damage buff. That's really nice. But yeah, trapping something is really useful, and most notably, there are lots of Pokemon that can be trapped. This deck does not run Defiance Fest, which is a bit of an issue for this card. You cannot trap Comfeys, you cannot trap Mews, you cannot trap a Pokemon like that. Well, sometimes you can, but like you can't trap Mew in the active if you're up against Gardevoir because they'll just KO you in 3 turns. Versus if you had Defiance Fest, you could. But well, if they don't lost fight, there's a lot of things going on with control. But anyways, you can trap a Pokemon like Radiant Greninja and Gardevoir, and you might just win the game. That's the main use. It does have other uses as well, but Mawile is a pretty powerful attacker, and because it can trap a Pokemon in the active. That being said, within tournaments, there are like weird time restrictions that can get actually super controversial because you can time out and you can kind of like manipulate it, and which is like against the rules, and then it gets a little weird. Um, but that doesn't matter for this, for the deck overview, and if you're playing this like on ladder or whatever. So yeah, Mawile is really good. It is pretty much what I'm saying, especially in ladder. Maybe not as good in tournament, but it's really good in ladder. Next up, obviously we have Rare Candy, Ultra Ball, Battle VIP Pass. Very straightforward. Rare Candy, obviously, for your Stage 2s necessary for Inteleon, Charizard, and Pidgeot. Literally none of them have Stage 1, so you can't get them into play without Rare Candy. Ultra Ball, obviously really good. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but Battle VIP Pass is useful. It's not my favorite card, but it is useful. Then we have Super Rod. Oh, I clicked on it. My mouse is acting up. Super Rod, which is Recovery and Palpad. This is really interesting. Obviously, Recovery is really powerful in a deck with lots of one-ofs. I mean, when I say it's interesting, it's really good. It's actually pretty straightforward why it's good, because, you play a lot of one-ofs. You want to be able to actually have your cards, and so you're going to recover them, especially if you have a card like, for example, Medicham V, which you may want multiple times in one game after it's knocked out, or multiple times. So you play it and it gets knocked out, you want to play it again. You can super rod it back in. Same thing with Palpad. Excuse me. For certain supporters, notably Thornton, Boss's Orders, Professor Turo's scenario, potentially Peonia, but I don't know. That seems kind of sketchy. And then you could also use it with any of your other supporters. It's certainly not bad there. So just recover Ionos or whatever. But yeah, it's a really good supporter, a really good card that recovers really good supporters or mediocre supporters in the case of Avery. But aside from that, you have a Hisuian Heavy Ball as well for bad basic Pokemon prizing. This can be useful. It's a very common inclusion in decks with lots of different basic Pokemon. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Counter Catcher talked about 4 Seal Stone, V-Star Power, cool card that lets you search for any card. You have a lot of Pokemon V, or I mean, you have 4 basic Pokemon V, which means that it's probably going to be active most of the time. Talked about Collapse Dam and Artizone. I talked about Double Turbo Energy, which can be used on Pidgeot EX, and it could be used on Talion, but mostly Medicham V as well, and Radiant Charizard. I will say it can be used to retreat as well. It's kind of useful for that. Rapid Strike Energy cannot be used to retreat most Pokemon, but it's really good for Rapid Strike Urshifu V Max. It's necessity, as well as it's also okay on Medicham V. Certainly it's usable and it's not bad. I mean, it is the best energy to put on it. You'd rather have it on Urshifu. And then, of course, 5 Fire is really low, but you'd have 2 copies of Super Rod and Raihan as a Palpad, so you can get by with that. But lastly, we need to talk a little bit more about Ultra Ball. Ultra Ball obviously searches out lots of Pokemon, which is useful in a deck with lots of Pokemon that are all different. In addition to that, it discards cards from your hand. In a deck like this, where you obviously aren't playing all these Pokemon every single game, you can just get rid of the stuff that you won't ever need this game, which is really useful. On top of that, it's really good with Bit Barrel because it allows you to shrink your hand size, and in fact forces you to shrink your hand size. But this brings us to a bit of a problem because I mentioned cards like Worker, Peonia, Avery, as well as Pidgeot EX, I'd say, and Rotama V are kind of aimed at getting big hand sizes versus Barrel, Squawkabilly EX, Squovit, potentially cards like Arvin, and certainly cards potentially like Raihan as well. And then certainly Ultra Ball are aimed at getting these smaller hands and then just having exactly what you need. So yeah, that's a bit of a weird issue with this deck, and I think that's definitely the biggest like weird thing. You have these cards that aim at big hand sizes and cards that aim at small hand sizes, and so you have that kind of be contrasted in the same deck. Normally, if you're playing Charizard, you run one or the other, maybe a little mix of both, but for the most part, you're leaning towards one. And I think this is the biggest thing holding this deck back because it has these differences. As I said, it performed well, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect or anything like that. But anyways, it's a really cool deck, and I figured this was a great experience, learning experience for all of us, and I was able to teach you something. So if I did, consider liking, subscribing, commenting that down below as well. And if I missed anything, I probably missed something. I might have missed a card, who knows. But yeah, pretty straightforward stuff for a lot of it. But when it gets put together, it gets really confusing. And so there's a lot of ins and outs. And as I said, I didn't cover everything. Like, oh, you can use Inteleon, plus its ability to one-shot Radiant Charizard, but then that's kind of weird because if you have Double Turbo, you don't. And then you can actually use Double Slap, but that doesn't always work, and you have some weird stuff going on there. Um, or double spin, but that's not good. And you have all these interesting dynamics. You have Squawkabilly EX, which you can attack with to power up your Radiant Charizard, and you have all these different things. But overall, the deck's really cool and really neat. I haven't played it yet, but it seems fun and it has some fun ideas. But I hope you enjoyed. As I said, like, subscribe, comment, hit the bell, all that good stuff, and I'm excited to see you in the next video.